Chapter 5 is titled the Integumentary System. This includes the skin and the accessory structures of hair and nails. Whenever you hear the root word derma or dermato, it's referring to skin. Let me give you some examples. For instance, a dermatologist is a person who helps people who have skin infections or other kinds of skin problems. Dermatology is the study of the skin and disorders of the skin, and dermatitis is inflammation of the skin. Let's first look at the cells of the skin. The keratinocytes are cells that contain the protein keratin. This is a tough protein that gives hardness to skin, but it's also found in nails and in hair. Melanocytes are cells that contain the pigment melanin. This is the pigment that gives your skin a darker color. So for instance, whenever you go out into the sun and get a suntan, that's due to the melanocytes creating more melanin. This melanin also protects the DNA of the skin cells. In essence, what it kind of does is puts an umbrella over the top of the nucleus of cells so that the UV radiation of the sun doesn't harm the DNA of the skin cells. Another cell that's found within skin are the Merkel cells. These are sensory receptors for touch. And we also have in our skin Langerhans cells. This is actually a macrophage, which engulfs bacteria and foreign particles and damaged cells. Let's now look at the layers of the skin. As you can see here, the skin consists of the layers of the epidermis and the dermis. There's also a layer that's not really part of the skin. It's found below the skin. That's why it's called the hypodermis, sometimes called the subcutaneous layer. Let's take a look at each of these now. The epidermis consists of closely packed epithelial cells. More specifically, the epidermis consists of keratinized, stratified squamous epithelium. You may remember from the chapter on the tissues that the word squamous refers to cells that are flattened. Stratified refers to epithelial tissue that consists of many layers. The epidermis protects us, and it would protect us against things such as abrasions, chemicals, things along that line. It also prevents the deeper layers from drying out. Our epidermis isn't soft like amphibian skin, it's harder. And so that prevents the moisture of the deeper tissues from evaporating. There are 5 layers of the epidermis, and there are a couple of mnemonic devices that you can use to remember their names. Corn lovers grow several bales, or come let's get sunburned. These terms refer to stratum corneum, stratum lucidum, stratum granulosum, stratum spinosum, and stratum basale. Let's take a look at each of these now. The stratum basale is the layer of the bottom, as the name indicates, but it's also called the stratum germinativum. Sounds a little bit like the word germinate, you know, what seeds do. This is the deepest layer of the skin, as again the name implies, and it also helps the epidermis attach to a layer called the basal lamina. The next layer up is the stratum spinosum. This consists of 8 to 10 layers of keratinocytes, and these are the cells that are actually generating keratin. The next layer up is the stratum granulosum. It consists of 3 to 5 layers of flattened keratinocytes, and these cells are dying. So in order to understand this a little bit better, we have to understand that there are no blood vessels in the epidermis. The blood vessels are down in the dermis. And in the dermis, these blood vessels supply oxygen and nutrients to cells. But as the cells of the epidermis are further and further away from the blood vessels, that means that they get less and less oxygen, and therefore they're going to die. So within the cells of the stratum granulosum, the organelles and the nucleus are disintegrating. The next layer up is called the stratum lucidum. This is actually only found in thick skin. It's found in the skin that's found on the fingertips, palms, and on the soles of your foot. The last layer, the layer on the top, is the stratum corneum. This layer consists of dead cells that are closely packed together. In essence, really, all these cells are just very thin packages of keratin. And so one other thing to mention is that when there's constant friction on the stratum corneum, you generate a callus. Let's now take a look at the dermis. The dermis contains blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, and nerves. There are other structures such as hair follicles and sweat glands as well in the dermis. And the dermis's role is it provides great tensile strength, that is, the ability to stretch for the skin. And this is due to the collagen and elastic fibers that are within the dermis. The hypodermis, as mentioned before, is not part of the skin. It connects the skin to the underlying fascia. That's this fibrous tissue that's found around bones and muscle. It contains areolar and adipose tissue. Adipose tissue is fat tissue. It also contains blood vessels. And it functions as fat storage for insulation and for cushioning. Let's now talk about pigmentation of the skin. The skin color is due to 3 different pigments. Melanin, which gives the skin a dark color. It also is found in hair and gives it color. Hemoglobin, which appears as a reddish color or pink color in those individuals who are light skinned. Hemoglobin is another pigment, and this shows up in light-skinned individuals. It gives the individual a pink or reddish color depending on how much oxygen is in the hemoglobin. Another pigment that is found in the skin is keratin. This is also found in egg yolk and carrots, and so if a person eats a lot of carrots, it will end up giving the person kind of an orange color. Another thing that we want to mention about pigmentation is freckles are just simply an irregular accumulation of melanocytes. And moles, those are large masses of melanocytes. Moles can be benign, that's non-cancerous, or they can be cancerous. Let's talk about moles and cancer a little bit. If you want to try to determine if a mole is cancerous, you need to follow the ABCD rule. Let's look at each of these letters. A stands for asymmetry. In other words, one half of the mole doesn't match the other half. B stands for border. If it has an uneven border, in other words, it might be scalloped or notched, it could be cancerous. C stands for color. It's not the same color all over. This is another sign of a mole being cancerous. D stands for diameter. If the mole is larger than 6 millimeters in diameter, it's possibly cancerous. And a good way to test this is to take a pencil and just put a pencil with the eraser end over the top of the mole. If the mole is bigger than 6 millimeters in diameter, it will show up and be outside the edges of the eraser. And E stands for evolving. In other words, the mole is changing in its size, color, or shape. Let's look at another topic of pigmentation. One abnormality of pigmentation is what's called albinism, and this is due to the melanocytes not being able to produce melanin. Vitiligo is a situation where a person has patches of skin that are kind of a light color, and the cause of this is not really known. Jaundice is another abnormality of the skin. You may have heard of this before. This is due to a buildup of a chemical called bilirubin. Bilirubin is a product of the breakdown of heme in red blood cells. It usually indicates that there's a liver disease, but there are other causes of jaundice. Let's now take a look at the accessory structures of the integumentary system. Hair is one of those structures, and it has a hair follicle. That's not really shown or labeled in this diagram. It is the cylinder that the hair shaft is located in. It also consists of a hair shaft, and hair also has what's called a hair root. This is the part that's attached to the hair follicle. Also attached to hairs are something called the erector pili muscle. This is a muscle that when it contracts, it makes your hair stand on end and gives you goosebumps. And what it's doing is trying to constrict the area so as to keep the heat in. Another structure that's associated with hair is something called the sebaceous gland. The sebaceous gland secretes an oil called sebum. This is an oil that goes into the hair and makes it somewhat oily. It also has some antibacterial effects. It will go up to the skin surface and helps prevent the growth of bacteria on your skin surface. The nails are another structure, of course, that are part of the integumentary system. And there's some interesting abnormalities that can show up on the nails if someone has a disease that's affecting their body. If you want to learn a little bit more about that, you can go to bit.ly/nails_disease with nails capitalized and disease capitalized. Sweat glands are another structure of the integumentary system. The anatomical term for sweat glands are sudoriferous glands. Most sweat glands are eccrine glands. These are glands that are found in a variety of places throughout your body, especially your palms, soles of your feet, and your forehead. The other type of sweat glands are known as the apocrine glands. These are found in densely hairy areas such as the armpits and the genital areas. Let's now talk about the functions of the integumentary system. One of the purposes of the integumentary system is for protection. When you think of your skin, you think of how it can protect you against abrasions and chemicals that you might come into contact with. It's also involved in thermoregulation. Let me explain. If you are running and you're getting very hot, you'll notice that your face gets red. What's happening is the blood vessels within the skin are dilating, and that's allowing the heat of the blood to escape into the environment. If on the other hand you're getting cold, one of the things that might happen is the blood vessels within the skin might constrict, and that will help to prevent the heat of the blood from escaping to the environment, and it'll also shunt the blood to the inner core. Another thing that the skin does is it acts as a place of blood storage. About 8 to 10% of your blood is within your skin. It's also involved in cutaneous sensations. We can detect things like touch, heat, and cold in our skin. It's also involved in excretion and absorption. Things such as amino acids and uric acid and sweat are excreted from the skin. Let's now talk about skin cancers. There's more new cases of skin cancer each year than the combined total of breast, prostate, lung, and colon cancers. And 20% of Americans will develop skin cancer in their lifetime. Let's now talk about the two most common types of skin cancer. Basal cell carcinoma is a type of cancer that originates from the stratum basale. You'll remember that that's the bottom layer. It usually develops on sun-exposed areas of the skin, such as the head and neck. Squamous cell carcinoma is the second most common skin cancer. This is one that looks often like scaly patches. Other types of skin cancers are actinic keratosis and Merkel cell carcinoma. Lastly, I want to take a look at the effect that the sun has on the skin. As you all know, the sun creates ultraviolet radiation, and the ultraviolet radiation increases the production of melanin, and we all, of course, have experienced this whenever we get a suntan. But that ultraviolet radiation can also cause damage to the DNA of the skin cells, resulting in skin cancer. But there's also another advantage of the sun, and that is that it increases the production of vitamin D in our skin. Vitamin D's role is it helps with the absorption of calcium in our intestine. Lastly, there's an interesting study that was done, and you can watch this TED Talk by going to the URL there on the slide. And this is a real interesting study because what they did is they looked at the incidence of heart disease based upon a person's latitude. And what they found is that the people who lived in the northern parts of a country who received less sun had a higher incidence of heart disease, while those people who lived in the south and received more sun, they had a fewer incidence of heart disease. So anyway, this is an interesting video. You might want to go watch it. I think you'll really learn a lot. So that wraps up our discussion of the integumentary system.